Well, hello and welcome to the Illinois Learn to Hunt question and answer session. My name is Dan Stevens.
And I'm Jason Buckley.
And today we are joined by Bob Caveny. Bob, if you could give us a little bit of background about yourself and maybe kind of what your position with the Illinois DNR entails.
I'm Bob Caveny. I'm the Agriculture on Grassland Wildlife Program Manager with the IDNR. Basically, I'm responsible for the quail and pheasant and rabbit and dove hunting programs through the state, as well as all upland birds, grassland birds, bobolinks, dick thistles, all that kind of stuff. So it's my responsibility to work and ensure that we have enough adequate habitat for those birds and work on farm bill issues such as CRP and our state acres for wildlife enhancement program.
Excellent. It certainly sounds like you have your hands full there.
Definitely do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. You know, the past kind of experts we've had on have really all focused on kind of particular game species. So you'll be kind of the first panelist here who works a lot with non-game species as well. So it'll be interesting to see how we can kind of tie some of that in as we move along. But we'll go ahead and get started right away. Our first question comes from Lisa. And Lisa asks, why does the Illinois DNR have a controlled pheasant program? Allowing people to hunt pen-raised pheasants on public land does not seem like fair chase.
One of the main reasons that we have a controlled pheasant hunting program is because it gives a controlled environment for new young hunters or new adult hunters a chance to get out in the field and to participate. A lot of times there may not be places for people to go, and this allows them a chance to go out and try the sport and see how it's going. The DNR does have a lot of area that we do use for the free upland permit system, but that's still limited across the state. So our controlled pheasant hunting program gives the opportunity to more people to get out to try the sport, and also helps drive license sales, which brings more habitat back to the state of Illinois.
Excellent.
Yep. Benjamin was wondering if do captive released upland birds survive and reproduce in the wild?
The IDNR has done a study on releasing pen-raised birds in the quail range or in the pheasant range across the state. Most of what that study has shown is that captive raised birds do not survive and incorporate their genes into the genetic pool of the wild birds left across the state of Illinois. Most of the time, pen-raised birds will also carry additional diseases and that kind of stuff into the wild population, and so it can be detrimental to the birds that are left. Now, raising quail and pheasants for training bird dogs or for hunting activities is understandable and a very accepted practice for many upland hunters, but trying to release birds to establish a wild population is not going to work and actually can detriment the birds that are left on the landscape. Most pen-reared birds will not last more than a week left out in the wild.
Oh, wow. I do kind of have a follow-up question. You mentioned that, you know, a lot of people use these pen-raised birds for dog training, essentially. Has there been any studies that looked at essentially does, you know, training your upland dog on pen-raised birds, does that impact their ability to find wild birds later on? Do they kind of gravitate more towards being successful in just finding pen-raised birds rather than wild birds?
I have not noticed any of that. The ability of dogs to use their nose to train in on the quail or pheasant scent is a very useful tool in either hunting pen-raised birds or wild birds. And I think the utility of having those pen-raised birds to train your dogs, so when you do get the opportunity to go out in the field and hunt wild game, your dogs know what they're looking for.
Sure.
And that's an important opportunity to have. You know, unfortunately, I wish there was quail in every ditch that you could just run around and you know, train your dogs with those, but sometimes that's not feasible, or depending, especially if you're in a more urban area, you know, you have to raise a few birds to help train your dog throughout the year. So,
sure, great answer. We'll kind of move on. This kind of tailors into that same concept of you know, wild versus captive reared pheasants, and this comes from Tyler. Has Illinois DNR looked to expand wild pheasant hunting opportunities?
We definitely are working on expanding wild pheasant hunting opportunities. Over the last year, the DNR has acquired 320 acres that we've added to our pheasant habitat areas program. We're hoping to add a little more by the end of the year. I know there's some things they're working on there. Currently, with all our upland sites as well, they're analyzed on an annual basis by our district wildlife biologists to see what's suitable to be hunted on that property. And so all the DNR properties are evaluated annually to see what kind of hunting opportunities may exist and what can fit in with the other programs going on those sites. And so, like I said, we're constantly looking at that. Another opportunity will come through the Illinois Recreational Access Program. It's a private lands program that was funded by the Farm Bill, and they received another grant here at the end of last year to expand that program for another 3 years. And they do have a quail and pheasant hunting and rabbit hunting program in the month of December. So it'd be the last 3 weekends for quail and pheasant hunting and the last 3 weeks of December for the rabbit hunting program through IRAP. And you can get on the website and look up their information.
That's great. Yeah, and I actually just saw, I think the IRAP program essentially increased an additional archery hunting as well. So there are a lot of opportunities outside of just upland game. So, you know, if you're struggling to find land access, the Illinois Recreational Access Program is a huge program and something definitely to look into.
Yeah, and IRAP also has changed its deer seasons. They're having a youth firearm deer season in early October. And then they also added a third archery deer season at the end of December. So after all the firearm deer seasons have pretty much finished, I think there might be a muzzle loader or hand loader season in there, but open it up after the main brunt of deer season has passed to maybe get some more opportunity to hunters that wouldn't otherwise have it.
Sure, that's great.
Yeah, that is awesome. Okay, so our next question comes from Sarah, and she was wondering, with much emphasis on the importance of prescribed fire recently, is Illinois DNR looking to extend the capacity for burning on public sites?
The IDNR is constantly looking to expand its capacity to burn. The first thing about prescribed fire is burning for the right thing, burning with a purpose, not necessarily just going out there and burn to burn. Why are you conducting a prescribed burn? And that can vary between grassland and forest land and habitat types. But that is one thing definitely to look at. But we constantly are looking at our habitat and our goals for each of the property and trying to utilize fire as a tool to manage them as much as possible. Now, there are other ways we're currently looking to expand that, including, always looking to form more prescribed burn associations, as well as DNR recently signed a MOU with Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever and other nonprofit groups to help conduct management on our state parks. In the past, it wasn't allowed to have volunteers come on and do actual habitat management type stuff. Now we have the framework in place that groups and volunteers can come in with supervision from site staff or the district wildlife biologist and conduct habitat management on the properties, and that includes prescribed burning. So we're looking at ways to expand it constantly and manage our habitat better and more efficiently.
Excellent. I'm kind of staying on the same topic of prescribed fire. Kathy asks, I've heard the timing of prescribed fire impacts and can influence the vegetation's response. For example, fall fires favor forbs. Can you discuss what responses are expected and what causes that specific vegetation response?
Well, that goes back to what type of habitat are you trying to manage? In a grassland situation, constant burning in the spring, which is pretty typical of what you see across much of the tall grass prairie region, favors grasses. And that's why over time, those stands become grass dominated. They become ranked stands of heavy, Indian grass or switchgrass, something like that. If by burning in the fall, you basically are opening up the soil to allow your flowering species, your forb species, to start to germinate before it gets warm enough for the warm season grass, which takes higher soil temperatures to, really take off in a lot of places. It allows those forbs to get up above them and shade them out. And so that's what, during a fall, or you don't even have to necessarily do it in the fall. It's a dormant season burn, because if you burn up through February, if you get we've had those 50-degree days when it's dry in early February and into March, before everything starts to bloom, that are good days to do a burn. Has the same effects of opening up that layer for removing the thatch for better forage production. Some other uses of prescribed fire, such as a summer burn, will help set back your grasses when they're actively growing. These types of burn are very hot and humid, but it can also set back several invasive species such as Sericea lespedeza, also woody encroachment. So if you have trees or bush honeysuckle or autumn olive starting to move out into your grassland areas, conducting a summer burn will help knock back those species and open it back up for more grassland.
Now, in those cases where you're trying to utilize fire to knock back those invasive species, is that something that you kind of have to put constant fire on, every other year or every few years? Or is it something that you can come in, do a prescribed burn, and then maybe treat with some herbicide applications? Or does a fire regime, affect that plant community more so?
A prescribed fire definitely will affect the plant community. Now, it may not kill every plant out there, but it is still the most cost-effective tool that we have. So I would recommend doing a fire and then coming back and doing a herbicide treatment. You may only have to treat half the plants at that point. The ones that survived the fire, you still reduce the amount of spray you have to put on the ground. Plus, anything that resprouts or comes back at that point, you'll be able to knock it out before it's able to grow again and become a problem. And so I recommend following up a prescribed fire with a spot herbicide treatment.
Just kind of a quick follow-up, since we've talked about prescribed fire quite a bit. If we have any landowners that are listening and are interested in trying to implement a prescribed fire plan on their specific property, who should they contact for kind of guidance and recommendations on that?
As far as prescribed burn on private property, there are EPA permits that a landowner must obtain. There would be some people, especially in Southern Illinois, the Southern Illinois Prescribed Burn Association would be a good contact group to get a hold of. Your local NRCS offices, some counties do have Pheasants Forever or other nonprofit farm bill biologists that would be able to help that. There are a couple of burn specialists throughout the state. I know there's one in Fulton County area over there right now to assist with that. But my biggest recommendation would either be reach out to your local NRCS office or your local district wildlife biologist.
Excellent. Thank you.
Tommy asked, how much of Illinois DNR land is sharecropped by agricultural producers? And is DNR looking to expand sharecropping efforts?
Currently, the DNR has close to 30,000 acres across the state that we currently row crop and use for our wildlife purposes. Some of the main things our tenant farmers do for us is our dove hunting program is dependent upon our tenant farmers. In many places, the tenants plant all the sunflowers for the dove hunting program, as well as the management practices that they carry out on our fields are developed by our district wildlife biologists and our site superintendents to help benefit wildlife and make sure that there's adequate food and cover there nearby for those species,
Sure. Tom has another follow-up here. He was wondering, are agricultural producers required to leave a certain percentage of crop standing for wildlife food?
On some of our leases, we do have that written into the contracts that a certain percentage is left. However, we are starting to move away from that as a DNR. Most of Illinois is a giant agricultural wasteland, not wasteland, but has waste grain available across the landscape for birds. And basically, leaving the crops there doesn't benefit as well. So we're trying to move towards more leaving areas fallow every year to come up in annual weeds and forbs and allow those to become, brood rearing areas and stuff for our upland game birds. And then every other year farm them to set back succession and keep them in those early stages instead of leaving standing crops. So we're still looking at ways to provide more food for the wildlife and the habitat needs that they require, while reducing a little bit about how much we farm to leave for food, because there's plenty of corn and beans left on the ground across the landscape for birds.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's a great point. Illinois is kind of a buffet for a lot of wildlife species.
most of our birds don't die of starvation across
Sure.
the state. They die from lack of habitat. So
Great point. Sticking on the same concept of habitat, Kristen asks, research has shown that woody vegetation is critical for wintering upland birds, particularly northern bobwhite. But it seems many native worm season grass stands, both on public and private land, lack this woody cover. How important is this woody cover to wintering birds?
well, it depends on the species of wintering birds. Bobwhite quail definitely have a requirement for woody vegetation. They generally will not travel more than 300 yards from woody vegetation, even out in open grasslands. They want to have areas of escape cover that they can get to quickly. As you go further north and get in more into the pheasant range, pheasants prefer a treeless landscape. They don't like a lot of trees or wooded areas, woodland ditches. They require a larger, just pure grassland areas. And there's other species that are dependent upon more large open grassland. So it goes back to which type of grassland birds you're really looking at. It can really go the whole spectrum, but there's birds that are specialists in open grasslands, and there's ones that are specialists in 50% grassland, 50% shrubland. But quail definitely need shrubby vegetation, and how we're trying to address that on public land is form more of like quail islands, planting a few trees and shrubs and that in small patches throughout the complex, which gives that escape cover within 300 yards, but leaves everything else open for your grassland dependent bird species.
Sure. And, just to kind of add on and another follow-up question, I remember a few years ago during a CRP sign up, the Wildlife Habitat Program, the CP4D, a lot of those programs required you to have a certain percentage of shrubby, kind of woody vegetation present. Do you know if that still occurs in some of the CRP programs, or have they kind of shifted away from that in recent years?
CP4D would still allow you to have a shrub and tree component in it, depending on what practices and stuff that you signed up into. Most of your other CRP practices, unless they're tree plantings or that don't usually have a tree or shrub component in it. Your pollinator plantings, you can incorporate some shrubs into it, especially your flowering pollinating shrubs, which are great for all your pollinators and everything else. That does become an issue sometimes with prescribed fire as a management tool. Sometimes your shrubs do not like and won't survive those type of fire regimens that would benefit the majority of your other plants and your pollinator planting. So that's something definitely to think about.
Sure. And our next questions kind of continue this trend discussing CRP. So could you give us a quick background of the Conservation Reserve Program and kind of what it is?
The Conservation Reserve Program was developed in 1985, launched to basically remove ground from production to protect environmentally sensitive areas, as well as help stabilize farmers' incomes across the United States. It was a very volatile time in the markets and everything else, and ground that should not have been farmed was being put under the plow for that. So the program was developed to basically help farmers and raise crop prices. Now, the benefits of the program have been shown throughout the years over the last, I guess it's been 35 years since the program was originally constituted, that it did have a dramatic increase on bird populations, especially when we got up to the 40 million acre cap. That would have been back in the early 2000s. And since then, it has slowly dwindled off. We got back as low as 24 million acre cap. That's 24 million acres nationwide. And currently we're sitting at a 27 million acre cap. So actually in the 2018 Farm Bill, we got a few million more acres to help spread out across the nation to try to raise that. But basically what the program does is pay farmers a nominal fee to take their land out of production to increase water quality, reduce erosion, and improve wildlife habitat. And so the payments are made every year on an annual basis, and basically the landowner agrees to manage that habitat type or the program for the payment annually.
That kind of leads us directly into this next question. You mentioned this concept that, okay, the farmers get this payment, but they also have to manage that habitat that they implement. And so this question comes from Walt. With the recent CRP program sign up, we were able to choose our mid-contract management practice. Can you discuss the pros and cons of each of the mid-contract management practices? And assuming all things equal, which obviously probably is not the case, but what do you encourage, and kind of which mid-contract management would you prefer?
The one I would recommend first off is prescribed fire whenever possible. That's how native plants evolved in North America, with fire on the landscape. That's how these plants know how to grow and how to come back. That's why many of your native plants will develop their root systems first before they really start to develop above ground. It can take 3 years to develop or establish a prairie stand. Prescribed burning is a very useful tool. Like I said, it is very cost effective and efficient. The biggest downfalls of prescribed fire are learning how to do it and conducting safe prescribed fire on the landscape. A lot of landowners are nervous about doing that, but there are trainings out there. The National Wildfire Coordinating Group, the S130, S190, I would recommend anybody looking into wanting to conduct a prescribed burn to take those courses and learn a bit more about it. The next mid-contract management thing would be herbicide application, strip spraying. That is also a very useful tool, especially in removing woody vegetation. I've actually been doing this on my own farm here over the last couple months, working on trying to remove cottonwood out of my pollinator planting. And so going through, and you can either do spot or strip spraying. Spot spray is basically spraying each plant individually. A strip spray is in your prairie is, say you spray a 10-foot swath every 40 foot, you're going to set back a quarter of the prairie planting and basically open that back up to bare ground and let it come in with all those annual weeds and that kind of stuff that quail and other grassland birds depend on. So that was probably your second best tool if prescribed fire is not available. Mowing should be used as only a final resort. Mowing does have some negative consequences, especially on the timing of the mowing. I mean, you will definitely want to avoid mowing anything between April 15th and about August 1st. That's the primary nesting season. I say about August 1st because I like to mow about that last week of July into early August, because that allows milkweed to regrow and available for migrating monarchs in September and October. So shooting right for that August 1st time frame to mow is a good opportunity to get it completed and still have plenty of habitat. Remember to mow it high. A lot of people want to mow it like a yard when they mow it. Mow it 12 to 15 inches. That means most of the time leave your mower deck all the way up on most, especially smaller tractors. And knock off the tops of it, but leave plenty of overwintering habitat available for birds. So,
excellent.
Emily asks, I have restored nearly 20 acres of NWSG habitat, which is now 3 to 5 years old. However, with the lack of any other habitat nearby, we are not seeing any pheasants or quails utilizing the prairie. Is there any steps that we can take to encourage birds to move in?
My recommendation would be go talk to your neighboring landowners. Even small strips of waste area, as farmers call it, along a field road or along the ditches, can help support bird populations. And the more of those you can get spread out across your landscape and start connecting into other patches of habitat, the more likely that quail and other ground birds will be able to find it. Now, even with that being said, many of your migrating grassland birds, we're still probably utilizing prairie, even though it's out in the middle of nowhere. But as they're flying north or south, and they see a big savanna or a big oasis out there, that can be crucial to them. So I know you're probably focusing on quail, but there are still benefits to other wild or grassland birds, other wildlife, as well as insects. But like I said, the main thing is go talk to your neighbors, try to start patching habitat together. Even little strips go a long way. The NRCS and the state of Iowa have been doing some research on this and actually have a new CRP practice, CP43, which is the prairie strips practice. And it's basically planting prairie strips through your field to create that exact type of habitat to connect larger grassland blocks, as well as prevent erosion and improve water quality and improve pollinator success.
Cool. And just a follow-up, you mentioned the new program CP43 in some of those other states. Is that fairly similar to like a CP33 field edge border, except it's just not a field edge border? It can just kind of be anywhere in the field?
It is similar, that it is a straight line practice that can be anywhere in the field, and it does not have a footage requirement, as far as I know.
Cool.
Right
I'm looking forward to seeing the results.
They're probably looking at least 20 to 30 foot, I imagine, when they do those strips, but it's not 30 to 120, such as the quail field borders, and the field borders are only located on the edge of the field where this can go through the center. So like I said, even those waste areas that are along field roads or along ditches, can be very important to wildlife. And we actually lose much of our habitat that's left annually on the ground to mowing improperly throughout the year. So, being very conscious of that. I know we have to mow for safety around intersections and that kind of stuff. But if you don't have to mow it, if you can see around it and get around it safely, leave it. Because
sure.
Wildlife a lot of good. So.
And like you said, it doesn't take the neighbors having to, plant and restore their own prairie. Like you said, a lot of times it can just stop mowing for a few months, and that could probably help. So great point. We'll move right along to Demetrius's question. Demetrius asked, as a non-landowner, what can I do to encourage and benefit the restoration and management of grassland and or pollinator habitat?
As a non-landowner, there's many things you can do, or even a non-hunter, is go out and buy a habitat and waterfowl stamp. Your state waterfowl and habitat stamps can be bought over the counter any place hunting license is sold. You can collect them just like stamps from the post office if you'd like. You don't have to have a hunting license to get one, but all that money is brought back directly to the DNR to be used for habitat projects. And we're able to match it with federal funds and make that dollar go further on all our properties. So a lot of the funding for all the habitat management and stuff that's done, especially on our state fish and wildlife areas and our state parks, is all paid through the Habitat Stamp Fund. And that is one way that non-hunters or non-landowners can help. Another way is support your local nonprofit, non-governmental organizations, your Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever, National Wild Turkey Federation, Quail and Upland Game Alliance, Whitetails Unlimited, Ducks Unlimited. I can keep going on and on, but all of those groups definitely are out there on the landscape, having an impact, doing good things. And so I would recommend supporting those groups on the local level, and they generally help a lot of landowners put habitat projects on the ground that benefit grassland birds as well as quail, pheasants, and everything else.
Sure. And like you mentioned earlier, that Pheasants Forever recently signed an MOU with DNR to start essentially being able to conduct management practices and volunteer type events on DNR ground. So I'm sure in the future, once stay-at-home orders and stuff start to relax, I'm sure that's another good opportunity to kind of give back and help some of the grassland areas as well.
Yeah. And if anybody's interested in doing something like that, I'd recommend they reach out to their local site superintendent. They do have the paperwork and stuff set up for that. There does have to be a plan in place on what they're going to do and where they're going to do it, but it shouldn't be that difficult, and all the paperwork and stuff set up so anybody can contact their local park and volunteer to do habitat management.
Excellent.
Sam asks, what factors cause upland birds to sit longer before flushing?
One of the things that probably cause upland birds to sit the longest would be weather related. Generally, heavy snowfall or rain or other inclement weather are going to make birds, sit on the ground longer. Generally, most gallinaceous birds, including pheasant, quail, they like to run. They will run through adequate habitat and stay on the ground as long as possible. When they flush and get up in the air, they are available prey then to raptors and other type of birds when they're up above the grassland, not only ground nesting birds or ground predators, but inclement weather probably has the biggest impact on birds want to sit longer and not flush.
Next question is kind of something I'm interested in. How do you guys go about managing some of these public hunting areas? And also kind of a follow-up question, what are some of the data points and some of the other factors that are looked into in terms of how many hunters they allocate to these individual sites? Can you describe that process a little bit, as well as how some of the management occurs on these sites?
So our pheasant habitat areas, especially around Gibson City, are currently managed by our IDNR habitat team. They are up out of the Gibson City, and they have responsibility over 11 different pheasant habitat areas, and they are responsible for all the management and stuff that takes place on those. So those guys are constantly running and, either planting something, burning something, trying to cut down trees and other invasive vegetation. I couldn't be happier with what they're doing. We are trying to establish a second team down in southern Illinois on Burning Star Quail Focal Area in the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative. And so we're in the process of trying to get everything off the ground. We actually started management on that down there this year. Going back to the second part of your question, how do we set the hunting limits on each of our PHAs? So annually we have windshield cards as well as permit cards that go out to all our hunters that they have to return. That helps give us numbers on how many birds or how much game was taking off each of our areas. Those numbers are compiled annually, looked at. We also have our breeding bird survey upland routes, as well as we do point counts on all of our pheasant habitat areas every other year. So we're constantly looking at the bird composition, how many birds are there. We're looking at how many birds are harvested, how hard the hunting pressure is, and then we decide how many permits we're going to allow the next year to be allocated out to people through the 3 upland permit system.
Sure, thank you. And that proves a really great point, is the importance of accurate reporting and harvest reporting. It's not just this arbitrary process just to, make it difficult for hunters. It's really providing more information and more data points so that the managers can make the correct decisions on the ground. So that's a really good point.
Yep, it is vital that we get those cards back, and that's part of why we have requirements. They have to be returned, and we are working towards trying to make that process a little easier, a little more mobile friendly and everything. But we're not quite there yet. But that data is crucial to what we do and how we manage our areas.
Sure. Well, with that kind of concludes our question and answer session. So a huge thanks to Bob Caveny again for joining us and answering our questions today. And for all those of you at home, thanks for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you in the field sometime soon.